Thank you, Tim. That was great. So tonight, I want to say, I'm come here to say that Alberta independence is the way to preserve what was best about Canada. Like, Canada was once a very great country. For its first 100 years or so, Canada was known for exceptional national projects. We built a railway across the northern part of the continent. We built a country out of a rough and cold wilderness. We turned the wilderness into a prosperous and vibrant community, and our military was respected around the world. But since the 1960s, Canada has changed. Liberal leaders decided to remake Canada into a different kind of country, one that prioritized liberal social engineering over the country's historic identity and achievements. Now, this transformation was noticed and criticized by many Canadian patriots. I think the best critic of that, what the Liberals were doing, was Ted Byfield, the founder of Alberta Report magazine. Now, Ted Byfield actually grew up in Toronto, but he moved to Alberta, became a fervent Alberta patriot, and defended Alberta and historic Canadian identity. Now, when Ted Byfield was growing up in Toronto in, say, the 1930s and 40s, Canadians still thought of themselves as British North Americans. So our flag at that time was the Union Jack, or at least the red ensign with Union Jack in the upper corner. The Union Jack actually is comprised of 3 crosses: the Cross of St. George of England, the Cross of St. Andrew from Scotland, and the Cross of St. Patrick from Ireland. So the Union Jack is actually an explicitly Christian flag, and that represented Canada. But in 1965, Liberal Prime Minister Lester Pearson changed that flag. We got rid of the old red ensign, and we replaced it with the current flag. So we replaced an explicitly Christian symbol with a pantheistic symbol of the sugar maple. Like, the maple leaf represents the sugar maple tree, which actually doesn't even grow in Western Canada. So the change of the flag was kind of symbolic of the change that was happening to Canada. Now, when a government de-emphasizes its national identity, people are going to still want to identify with something, and so they identify with their region or their province. And Canadians have been criticized for identifying too strongly with their region and their province. But this is important because sometimes Albertans who support independence are accused of being disloyal to Canada. But this isn't really true, because Albertans who support independence are often those who remember and deeply love the Canada that existed before the Liberals wrecked it.
Right.
So, by 1980, by that time Pierre Trudeau had been Prime Minister for 12 years, he was already pushing fundamental changes to the country. So there was already 2 Canadas by 1980, as Ted Byfield would talk about. He said there was an old Canada and a new Canada. Old Canada was founded by Sir John A. Macdonald, and we got a constitution from him in 1867. But New Canada was being founded by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, who gave us a different constitution in 1982. So you have 2 different prime ministers, 2 different constitutions, and essentially 2 different countries, Old Canada and New Canada. And there are certain practical outworkings of this change from Old Canada to New Canada, and Ted Byfield kind of wrote about that. I just want to read a quote from Ted Byfield describing Old Canada versus New Canada. Old Canada had some harsh laws, but was safe to live in. New Canada has enlightened, lenient laws and is increasingly unsafe to live in. Old Canada was generally committed to the free enterprise system, modified where necessary. New Canada is increasingly committed to the socialist system, magnified where unnecessary. Old Canada met its military obligations, in fact served magnificently in 2 world wars. New Canada has virtually no army and has reneged on its military obligations. Old Canada was frugal and poor but paid its way. New Canada runs at a $14 billion deficit. That $14 billion deficit is 1980, so the same figures for today would be much larger than that. But these are 2 very different countries. And so the question arises as, which country is worthy of support? And so Ted Byfield went on to write, when people put the question, are you loyal to Canada, I have to ask, to which Canada? The one we used to know, or the one which Mr. Trudeau is forcing upon us? I certainly felt part of the first, but that country doesn't seem to be there anymore. About the second, I have grave doubts. So it's not a question of being disloyal to Canada. It's a question of determining which Canada you are loyal to.
Come on, that's good, that's good.
To be loyal to Trudeau's new Canada is to be disloyal to the Canada of old.
Right.
Pierre Trudeau transformed Canada into a different country, one that is no longer recognizable to many of us.
That's right. So
how was Trudeau able to transform the country so much? Since he didn't like Canada the way it was when he got involved in politics, how did he bring about these fundamental changes? Well, the simplest way to change a country comprehensively is to change the Constitution. The Constitution is the foundational document of any country. It establishes the governments and the roles and responsibilities. So the Constitution is actually what establishes the country as it is. So when you change the Constitution, you change the country. And this is something that Pierre Trudeau understood very well. Already as Justice Minister in 1968, he put forward his proposal to add to the Constitution Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and his proposal was published by the Government of Canada. So in this document, this proposal for a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Trudeau said that we needed to entrench our human rights in the Constitution explicitly. Like he wanted an explicit enumeration of rights the same way the Americans have in the Bill of Rights. He said if we don't have those rights explicitly enumerated in our Constitution, we actually don't have the protection that we need. But you know, it's true that many countries have explicitly enumerated rights in their Constitution, like the United States, but Canada did have protections for our rights. We just did it differently than the Americans and other countries. Like the British and Canadian way, protecting rights was kind of through a common law approach. We have rights that are based in the history that we have. But many people think it's much better to have explicitly enumerated rights like the Americans. But you have to remember, you know, when the Americans brought in their Bill of Rights in the late 1700s, at that time slavery was still legal. So they had their Bill of Rights for several decades while there was still slavery. So the Bill of Rights didn't protect those people, the slaves. Then when they got rid of slavery, for another 100 years or so, African Americans still didn't have the equal rights of other people for several decades. So the fact of having explicitly enumerated rights in a constitution does not make that a better system of protecting rights than the old Canadian way. Like we already had our rights protected, and when Trudeau made his proposal first in 1968, at that time there was no country in the world that had better protections for individual rights than Canada did. There were some other countries that protected them as good as Canada, like Australia, but there was no country with better protections, so we didn't really need a Charter of Rights to protect our rights because we already had that protection, just in a different way than Trudeau was talking about. But it's still, Trudeau was able to sell his project easily because when you go up to someone and say, well, don't you want your rights protected in the Constitution? People are going to say, yeah, of course I do. It just seems to be the obvious way, even though you know we were doing it pretty well already. But anyway, Trudeau was able to convince people that the Charter was the thing we needed, and for the most part, and so we did get that adopted in 1982. But when the Charter was adopted in 1982, there was a 3-year waiting period for much of it to come into effect, because they knew that there was many laws at the federal and provincial levels that were already in conflict with the Charter, so the governments were given 3 years to change their laws into conformity with the Charter before it came fully into effect. So it didn't come fully into effect until 1985. And in 1985, our Justice Minister was John Crosbie. You know, he was in the government of Brian Mulroney. So he was the Justice Minister who would oversee the Charter coming in fully into effect. And this is what he said with the Charter about to come fully into effect. He said this: "The public does not realize that we already have had a revolution in Canadian society. The adoption of a Charter was a revolution. It has changed the whole power structure of Canadian society. It has taken tremendous power from governments and given it to the courts of Canada, the Supreme Court of Canada, which is not widely realized. Therefore, we are in a whole new legal environment in Canada. There has been a revolutionary change." So the Justice Minister of Canada is saying the adoption of the Charter has brought revolutionary change. So it's kind of like the Charter was a Trojan horse. They sold it to us as a way of protecting our rights. We brought it into the Constitution, and now we're thinking, whoops, it looks like we've got this revolution happening. So it's like a Trojan horse. So over the next several years after the Charter was brought in, there were many laws and policies that were struck down on the basis of the Charter. You know, Canadians were told that the Charter would protect our rights, but what it really brought was a fundamental restructuring of our country. So Dr. William Gardner in 1994, he wrote that the Charter was, quote, "an entire state enterprise for the reshaping of Canada." He went on to write that Pierre Trudeau viewed the Constitution, quote, "as a means to the achievement of some ideal state, an instrument for forcing society into a predetermined social and political mold." And this is exactly what Pierre Trudeau achieved. With his so-called Charter of Rights, he essentially refounded Canada as a different country, one that fit his ideological program. So each and every day, courts across Canada enforce Trudeau's vision of Canada using his Charter of Rights. In this sense, Pierre Trudeau rules Canada from the grave. Now, he's dead and gone, but his ideology continues to shape the country and will continue to do so thanks to the Charter. And I just have a recent example of that also from the National Post. This is from January this year, January 2026. It's a column by Ted Morton, who was a political scientist at the University of Calgary for several decades, and then he became a cabinet minister in Alberta's government. This is called "The Charter is Gutting the Provinces, and the Data Proves It." It's based on a study done by Macdonald-Laurier Institute. So what happens was, the Charter gave extra powers over the provinces. So every year, certain provinces will have laws challenged at the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will strike down various provincial laws on the basis of the Charter. So this goes on year after year. Like, this is an incremental process. It's not like the Charter suddenly reduced the powers of the provinces. It's being done incrementally. And so Ted Morton wrote this: "When the court strikes down a provincial law, there is a vertical transfer of decision-making power from the provinces to the 9 judges sitting in Ottawa, all of whom have been appointed by the federal government. So we have this gradual process over time where the province is losing power to the national government. And this is something that Trudeau knew what he was doing. Like, he's been dead for 25 years, and yet his ideology continues to be imposed upon Canada year after year through the Charter. So that's one effect of the Charter. Another important effect of the Charter was to expel Christianity from its public role in Canada. You know, during Canada's first century, Christianity had a very significant place in Canadian society and government. You know, there were several explicitly Christian laws and policies, and in fact, many public schools had Bible reading and Lord's Prayer as one of their Christian policies. But Christianity's role in Canadian public life is essentially now gone, and that's because of the Charter. Adopting the Charter moved Canada towards a more Americanized relationship between church and state. Like, the United States has what's called the Establishment Clause in its Bill of Rights, and in recent decades, that's been interpreted to mean that the government can have no favoritism towards religion whatsoever. And although Canada did not adopt something like the Establishment Clause, the Section 2A of the Charter, which guarantees freedom of conscience and religion, has been interpreted by the Supreme Court as if we did have an Establishment Clause. So Canada is very different today than it was before the Charter. You know, although Canada never had an established church as a country, some of the maritime provinces actually had the Church of England established as the official church of their colonies, like in some of the maritime provinces. So that's something like in the 1800s. Also in lower and upper Canada, which is now Quebec and Ontario, there was what was called, some public land was set aside for the support of Protestant clergy. It was called the clergy reserves. So you have official land set aside by the government to help support Protestant clergy. In 1906, Canada adopted the Lord's Day Act, which was to prohibit certain business and recreational activities in Canada on the basis of the Fourth Commandment. Like, the Lord's Day Act protected the Lord's Day. And so certain businesses and recreational activities could not take place. Also, as I mentioned before, many provinces had reciting the Lord's Prayer and Bible reading in public schools, and some municipal councils in Canada would open their meetings with saying the Lord's Prayer. But after Trudeau brought in the Charter of Rights, those things were essentially abolished. Like, one after another of Canada's public Christian features was torn from the national fabric as a result of the Charter of Rights being adopted. First to go was the Lord's Day Act and the Big M Drug Mart decision of 1985. It was struck down, the Lord's Day Act was struck down specifically because it was a Christian-based law. The Lord's Day Act was based on Christianity. We are no longer allowed to have any Christian basis for any of our public policies in Canada. So then a couple years later, in 1988 and in 1990, we have 2 court decisions from the Ontario Court of Appeal. The first one put religious exercises out of the public schools, because in many Ontario public schools, they opened or closed the day with Lord's Prayer or Bible reading. That was put out in 1988. In 1990, the teaching of Christianity in Ontario public schools was also put out on the basis of the Charter. Like, there were some public schools in Ontario that would teach actual Christian content in some of their classes, in some of the religion classes. That was one of the regulations that Ontario had that would allow for that. But that was struck down in 1990 on the basis of the Charter. What's interesting though about those 2 decisions that I mentioned, especially the first one, when the judges were making the rulings, they imported some jurisprudence from the American Supreme Court. Like in the United States in 1962 and 1963, there were major Supreme Court decisions in the United States that put Bible reading and prayer out of the American public schools. There were very controversial Supreme Court decisions, some of the most controversial Supreme Court decisions in American history. And many Americans have traced the decline of their countries to those decisions. And yet those decisions, some of that jurisprudence was imported into Canada because of the Charter being adopted and used to strike down Bible reading and saying Lord's Prayer in Canadian public schools as well. Now, a few years after that, having town councils or city councils open their meetings with Lord's Prayer was also struck down on the basis of the Charter. And I might just add too that Canada's definition of marriage until 2003 was an explicitly Christian definition of marriage. Like, the definition had the word Christendom right in it. And that was struck down by the Ontario Court of Appeal on the basis of the Charter in 2003. And rather than appeal that decision, the federal government just decided to pass a law changing the definition of marriage in Canada to include same-sex marriage. So it wasn't the Supreme Court that ultimately overturned the definition. It was the Ontario Court of Appeal, and then rather than the Parliament decided just to change it rather than to let it go through the court process. But all of this is a result of Trudeau's constitutional changes of 1982. You know, until then, there were many cases where governments in Canada had explicitly Christian laws and policies, as I mentioned. But by adopting the Charter, Pierre Trudeau changed Canada into a different kind of country when it no longer recognized a role for God in public affairs. An intolerant secularism now pervades the government and guides many political decisions. I'll just throw in here too, one of the things that the Charter did was that it left out property rights. Trudeau did not want property rights in the Charter of Rights. When you think of it in English-speaking political theory, We've historically had protections for three main rights, the right to life, liberty, and property. And each of those rights restricts the power of the government. So when you remove one of those, you're actually increasing the power of the government. So by removing property rights out of that formula of right, life, liberty, and property, Trudeau actually expanded the power of the government over our lives, even though he told us he was protecting our rights. So besides changing the Constitution and with his charter, there's one other thing that I want to talk about that Pierre Trudeau changed along with his son, and that is Canada's national identity. Now, in order to do this, I first want to read a long quote from Ted Byfield explaining what he called Canada's national heritage, which is essentially the same as identity. I want to read this, so I apologize in advance, this is a long reading, but I want to contrast this with what the Trudeaus have brought in instead. So this is what Ted Byfield wrote. For what, when you get right down to it, is the national heritage? How did we get here? Are we not a people who crossed the seas, pushed back the forests, charted the rivers and lakes, ran the railways through the mountains, broke the prairies, and tamed the barrens of the Arctic? Are we not a people who found gold in the Precambrian, oil in the Beaufort, and grew food for the world where men could hitherto scarcely find food enough for themselves? Are we French? Are we English? We are both. And German, Polish, Ukrainian, Dutch, Chinese, and who knows what else. Why did we come here? For most, there was a single answer: land. For land, the Carignan-Solaire Regiment established the first substantial settlement in Quebec. For land, the Loyalists came. For land, the Eastern Europeans peopled the Western Prairie. For land, the Chinese built with their blood the railways. The Japanese opened the fishery, and the Jews of Russia created Winnipeg's North End and the thousand cultural endeavors that have flowed from it. What all these people wanted, in other words, was private property, safe from expropriation, safe from tax collectors, safe from thief and marauder. Property, that is, meant freedom, and freedom was worth life itself. What did we believe? We believed in God. Religion was either the chief motive for or indispensable companion of almost every settlement. It was both puritanical and authoritarian, be it the authority of the Bible or the authority of the church. It was narrow, intolerant of nonconformity, and quick to condemn what it viewed as corruptive, but it was not anti-intellectual. Religion, in fact, established our school system, and a tough system it was, sparing neither rod nor child. It knew its goals, and against them it examined pupil and teacher remorselessly, overworking both. Indeed, work was a thing it reveled in, lots of it, with back and brain, dawn to long past darkness, men, women, and children included. If a man would work, he should live. If he would not work, he should starve. If he could not work, it was up to the community to care for him, generously and positively, with the hope that he would one day care for himself. With the faith came the family. In families we arrived. In families we divided the land. In families we saw our children grow and prosper. In families we found companionship, purpose, comfort, warmth, guidance, and an occasional cloud on the ear. Was the mother of this family exploited and oppressed? She certainly was. Being exploited and oppressed was at once her burden, her privilege, and her delight. That's what motherhood was about. In fact, in a sense, that's what the whole family was about. Either you believed in it or you didn't. We believed in it so much, we quite readily fought for it, whether in the schoolyard or in the trenches. For we are indeed a fighting nation. Scarcely had the first shots been fired when we plunged into 2 world wars, years before the Americans. And those years we spent berating them for their backsliding cowardice. We left our blood and bones on the slopes of Vimy Ridge until we had hacked our way to the top of it, something the army of no other nation had been able to do. We were tied to posts and bayoneted at Hong Kong. We tore through the skies in the Battle of Britain, and we lived in Germany with the corpses of our WAGNER crews. But these were wars of justice, and we won them. We do not apologize for this. So, in my view, this essentially summarizes many of the main themes of Canadian identity. Our ancestors, or at least for most of us, our ancestors came here for land and for freedom. Many were strongly committed to their religion, usually Christianity. They believed strongly in the traditional family, and they were proud of Canada's military. That's our historical identity. But Pierre Trudeau did not like this historical identity of Canada, and he wanted to undermine it. So what did the Liberals want instead? We might remember in 2015, after Justin Trudeau was elected, he gave an interview to the New York Times. He told the New York Times that Canada has no core identity. It's the first post-national state. And in saying these things, the New York Times pointed out that Justin Trudeau was the avatar of his father's vision, like he was fulfilling his father's vision and saying that Canada has no core identity and is a post-national state. So what did the Liberals want instead of our historical identity? They wanted Canada to be identified by abstract universal concepts. Abstract universal concepts. Diversity, tolerance, inclusivity, multiculturalism. Those are abstract universal concepts. So instead of a particular specifically Canadian identity, we'll have an identity based on these abstract universal concepts, which are shared by many Western nations, right? Canada would be post-national, in the sense that there's nothing to identify us uniquely as Canadians. Just these abstract universal concepts. But many people in Canada still remember the old Canada and what it meant. We want our country back.
Yeah.
This is why we support Alberta independence. Good old Canada has vanished. In its place, we have new Trudeau Canada, which reeks of wokeism, socialism, and an emerging police state.
True.
But an independent Alberta can and will uphold the noble traditions and freedoms of the original Canadian dream.
Woo!
Thank you.
Woo! Amen.